All right. Thank you. Thank you, Torrin. Okay. I'm going to clip this over here. There. Okay, now I'm going to read today from John's Gospel, and from chapter 1. And there's a particular word here I want to draw your attention to. Of course, the way it's used in the context is important too. This is John's Gospel, chapter 1, starting with verse 11. So, here in verse 11, he says, speaking of Jesus, it says, He came unto His own, and His own received Him not. But, verse 12 says, as many as received Him, to them He gave power. Gave He power. The word power there doesn't mean force or ability. It means privilege or authority is literally what it means. Exousia is the Greek word. It doesn't mean power in the sense that you have power to do something. It means you have a right or a privilege is what it really means. We could read it that way, that He gave them the privilege or the authority or the benefit to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on His name. Verse 13 says, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Now in this little passage here, going back again to verse 11, in verse 11 and 12, in both those verses, he uses the word received. In verse 11, it says, He came unto His own, and His own received Him not. The next verse, of course, contrasts that with those of us who did receive Him. Now, when it says, just to be clear about this, to make sure it's crystal clear, there's no misunderstanding, when it says He came to His own, and His own received Him not, He doesn't mean Christians. The Christians are those who received Him. In fact, that's what makes you a Christian. That's what defines you, what he says afterwards. When it says He came unto His own, he's speaking of the nation of Israel, the first century nation of Israel. The nation of Israel, which was established in the Old Testament, to which the prophets were sent again and again, beginning with Samuel and kings, beginning with Saul and then David and then onwards after him, kings and prophets sent by God. Jesus came to that nation of Israel, that first century nation of Israel, with their long history, and not always just to be honest, not always a positive history. If you read the Old Testament, many of the prophets were sent with a message of judgment to them. And as Jesus points out in the Gospels, He says, which of the prophets did you not kill and stone and put to death? Jesus came to the nation of Israel, the first century. I keep saying first century so that you understand I don't mean the current political entity today. We're talking about the Old Testament people of God as represented by the nation of Israel. Jesus came to them as the last prophet. The last prophet. He was their last opportunity. He spoke to them in that kind of language. He said in the Gospels, He said, I am not sent to anyone except the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That was in His earthly ministry. He didn't go on a world tour. He was sent specifically and exclusively to the nation of Israel, their last opportunity. He was their last prophet. He gave many parables about that. One of them, he said, there was a certain man, a landowner, and he had a vineyard. And in this vineyard, he appointed people to take care of the vineyard, and then he sent to them his representatives to receive from the fruit of the vineyard, and they treated them despitefully, is what the King James says. And some of them they beat, and some of them they stoned, and some of them they killed. And so finally, he said, last of all, he sent his son, saying, they will reverence my son. But instead, they cast the son out of the vineyard, and they said, if this is the son, let us cast him out and kill him, and we'll take the vineyard for ourselves. when he gave that parable, standing in the temple, by the way, it said the chief priests and the rulers knew he spoke of them. He came as the last prophet to the nation of Israel. And this is what the verse means when it says he came unto his own. They were his own. He came to them. And it says they received him not. Now that's excluding a small number. Paul calls them a remnant, and using language from the Old Testament prophets. A few, only a few did. The 12 disciples, for a few, and few followers. But by and large, the nation at large, as represented by their leaders, conspired with the Romans, arranged to put him to death, and at his trial, they cried out, the chief priests and the rulers and the leaders of the people cried out publicly, "We have no king but Caesar," repudiating Christ. It's a very serious thing, and a lot of the things you read in the New Testament concerning what we call the apocalypse and in the book of Revelation are actually dealing with that very issue, the judgment upon Israel because of that. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want you to notice it says he came to his own, but it says what they didn't do, it says they received him not. And then in the next verse, in verse 12, it says, as many as did receive him. The word receive, if you look it up in the concordance or any other kind of study tool, you'll find out that the word receive, and elsewhere in the New Testament, is a Greek word pronounced lambano, L-A-M-B-A-N-O. Lambano is, let me make sure I said that right, yeah. And let me give you some definitions. I looked these up. These are the possible ways this word can be translated. It can mean to take, or to take up, or to take to oneself, or to join oneself to. It can mean an association, to accept, or to acknowledge. And I'm going to add my own word, to embrace. That's what I think it means in this context. They rejected him. They didn't embrace him, in other words. They didn't connect to him. But it says in verse 12, now we're talking about Christians here, because this is what defines us as Christians. This is what makes us a Christian. And you notice that in this passage, John, here, let me just read it again, verse 12, as many as received him. To take to oneself, in other words. And I'm going to use my word, to embrace. There's a lot of ways you can say that, but I think you get the picture from those different words. To connect to accept. Sometimes in old-fashioned kind of language, if you bring someone into your home, you've received them into your home. And sometimes you go to a formal, there's a receiving line. That's what that's talking about. A person who is received is accepted or embraced, you might say. But as many as embraced him, accepted him, took hold of him, received him, to them he gave the power, the privilege, to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. Now you notice that in talking about us as Christians here, he doesn't bring in to the equation anything to do with actions or performance or behavior or anything like that. It's purely on the basis of the fact that we received him and believed on his name. And really that's kind of two different ways of looking at the same thing. That's how we receive him. We believe in him, or we place our trust in him. But you notice this language. This is what defines us as Christians. This is what makes us a Christian. Not because we're perfect, because we're not. Even though we have a Christian has a conscience that makes him aware of every little small failure, and we want to be good. But as long as you're living in a body of flesh and blood, I guess I don't want to burst your bubble, but I just got to tell you the truth. As long as you're living in a physical body, there's going to be the potential to make mistakes. And to fail, and to do things wrong, and to say things you wish you hadn't said. And I'm not pointing fingers at anybody else, I'm talking about me right now. See, the reason I can say all that is because that's my experience, and I think it's just the human experience. That's just part of being a human being, you see. But as a Christian, what makes us a Christian is not because we're always perfect and that we never make a mistake, or that we never, say or do something that we realize later we should not have said or done. That doesn't enter into it. The reason we're a Christian, what makes us right with God, the basis of our Christianity, is just one thing. We received Him. As many as received Him. To them He gave, and think about this word, the privilege, the right to be called the sons of God. We're sons of God not because we did anything to accomplish that, but because we received Him. That's the point. Now, keep that in mind, and look at something else. This is in Luke chapter 15 and verse 1. Luke chapter 15 and verse 1. We're talking here about Jesus. And it says in verse 1, Luke 15:1, then drew near unto Him all the publicans. Again, not the Republicans. That's somebody different. The publicans are, generally we say these are the tax collectors. That's the general description. In digging into this a little deeper, at least in the King James translation, the reason they chose this word publican, which is kind of a funny word to use, the reason they chose that word when the King James translation was made is a publican has reference to a person who runs a public house or a tavern or an inn. In those days, that's where you would go to stay if you were traveling, and it also you could get a meal, and also there was typically like a tavern. There was drinking and socializing going on. And so consequently, the people who ran those places were not necessarily the people with the best reputation. And they called them publicans because they ran the public house. And so that's the word that's chosen here. And in first century, where people congregated like that, these people, it's understandable that the Romans would appoint them to be the tax collectors, because that's where people congregate. So they're looked down upon in Israel because they were collaborating with the Romans, and then they're not only that, they're running these taverns and who knows what all's going on there. And so they had a bad reputation. So, and you get from the context to point two, then drew near to Him the publicans and the sinners. And so you get the idea, for to hear Him. In contrast to the holy people or the righteous or those with spotless reputations, like the scribes and the Pharisees, for instance. So the publicans and the sinners, it says, drew near to Him. That's Jesus. This reminds me of what we read in the previous verse. It said, He came to His own, and His own received Him not, but as many as received Him. This is a way of saying this kind of the same thing. So they drew near to Him, or in other words, they came to Him. They were attracted to Him. Verse 2, the Pharisees and the scribes, they were offended by this, and they murmured. Now look at what he says, what their complaint was, what their accusation was. The Pharisees and the scribes murmured, and they said, this man receives sinners and eateth with them. And they were right. They were correct in what they said. Now, in John we read, as many as received Him. In other words, that's we receive Him. But notice here, the Pharisees point out, which is true, that He receives us. We receive Him. In other words, we accept or take hold or embrace Him. But He, in turn, looks at us and takes or acknowledges or takes unto or embraces us. We embrace Him, but He embraces us. And I would argue that the only reason we can receive Him is because He received us first. He embraced us. And He didn't shun these sinners and these publicans. That's what the Pharisees are mad about. He embraced them. He received them. So here, we receive Him, we read that, and now we read the Pharisees complain that He receives us, or He receives, Jesus receiveth or takes unto Himself or acknowledges or embraces sinners. And this can be verified in many different ways. This whole chapter, in fact, is dedicated to Jesus answering their observation that He receives sinners, and He gives parable after parable to demonstrate that. For instance, the first one, He says, well, let's just go on reading. Verse 4. What man of you having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after that which is lost until he find it? By this he's referring to the people they're calling the sinners and the publicans. He says he's like the shepherd. And notice that in this parable, he's not just standing there indifferent and waiting for the lost sheep to come and find him. He takes upon himself the responsibility to go and find the one that's lost. In fact, he is after them, and it says when he's found it, verse 5, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. Well, this is just a way of saying he took hold of it. He embraced it, put it on his shoulders. The others he left in the wilderness, the 99. Verse 6 says, when he cometh home, he calleth his friends and his neighbors, saying unto them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. Notice, I found my sheep. Not that the sheep, finally figured it out and came and found me. He said, I found my sheep which was lost. In other words, he is after and goes to receive and to embrace and to take hold of. And not only that, he put it on his shoulders in a very close and an intimate way. And not only that, he's saying, now let's rejoice, let's get happy about it. This is something we should celebrate. What the Pharisees were complaining about, he's saying we should celebrate this. And I say unto you likewise, verse 7, joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than the 99. And what we don't get when we read the King James translation is we don't get the way that he said these words. And I think there's a certain sarcasm in what he said. I think if you would have seen him, if it were today, here's how he would have said it. There's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than 99 just persons. He's talking about the scribes and the Pharisees. I say that because elsewhere he turned to them and he said, you're a bunch of hypocrites. He said, you appear outwardly righteous unto men. So when he says he's likening them to the 99 he left in the wilderness, but the one that is the lost sheep, which symbolizes the sinners and the publicans. And notice that when it says there's joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, what is it that they did? All they did was they drew near to him to hear him. That's all. That's all I read. They drew near to him to hear him. In other words, they came to him. They were attracted to him. That's all. You could say they embraced him. But the way he tells the parable is he's the shepherd. He's on the lookout. The reason we can embrace or receive him is because he's already embraced and received us. He tells another parable here in verse 8. Either what woman having 10 pieces of silver, if she lose one, doth not light a candle and sweep the house and seek diligently till she find it? It's not that the piece of silver is lighting the candle and seeking for the woman. It's the woman who lit the candle and she's seeking diligently for the piece. He's saying, I'm like this woman. I lit a candle. I'm seeking diligently for all these that will. What did they do? They just drew near to him. They came to him. That's all. That's all we can boast about doing. We came to him. We embraced him. And when she's found in verse 9, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, rejoice with me. You notice again, this is something to celebrate. I have found. Notice it's not the peace found me, but I have found the peace that was lost. Likewise, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. Once again, what he's calling repentance is nothing more than the fact that they drew near to him. That's all I read in the text. They drew near to him to hear him. And that's what made the scribes and the Pharisees murmur, saying, this man receiveth sinners. In other words, he embraces ordinary people, all those who draw near to him. Now, here's what we've seen so far. John said, as many as received him. The Pharisees pointed out that he receives sinners. We receive him, he receives us. We embrace him, he embraces us. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because of that, look at what he says, look at what Paul says in Romans chapter 14. Paul uses the same word in a slightly different context here, but it means the same thing. But look at what he says. Romans chapter 14. This is at the end of his letter to the Romans. There's only a couple of chapters left, so he's wrapping things up and he's giving them what he considers to be practical advice in their day-to-day lives. He says, chapter 14, verse 1. Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. So he's talking now about, he's writing to the Romans, the Christians there in Rome, and he says, hey, you Christians there, he's talking about other Christians who, as we're going to see here, well, let's see what he means by weak in faith. Him that is weak in faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. Verse 2, for one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth only herbs. Verse 3, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that eateth not despise him that eateth. Why? For God hath received him. In other words, he's talking about Christians who have different opinions, different points of view, who see things differently from one another. And so back to verse 1 again, he said, he that is weak in the faith, by that he means who sees things differently than you do. That's really what it means. He's saying, you can be a Christian, and it's not just you and God alone in this world. There's other Christians. And other people, other Christians, may see things differently than you and may have different opinions about things. But, he says, for such people who believe things different than you do, you should, here's what it says, not only we receive Christ and Christ receives us, but other Christians, even if they think differently than you do, it says receive them. In other words, it's not just you embrace Jesus and Jesus embraces you. You should also embrace other Christians. And specifically, he points out that have differences. And the reason is we embrace one another because God has embraced all of us. That's why, because God has received him. Now you notice it says, him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations, which is kind of a funny little turn of phrase. I think if I were ever going to write a history of the church, I would call it Doubtful Disputations. Because the one thing that the church has done in the last 2,000 years is it has done the one thing Paul said don't do. The church, by and large, over the last 2,000 years, has majored in splitting into fragments over doubtful. You see, doubtful means things that are in doubt. Things that are, what you could also say is trivial. Disputes over trivial matters. I point this out from time to time. When Elliot and Isabella were here, they asked to see the book, so I had to go dig it out. I really do have this book. It's called Denominations in the United States, and I've read this book before, and it's all about how all the different denominations all split apart from one another over the most trivial matters. Like, for instance, I was reading it one day and said this, there's a chapter on all the different churches that call themselves fire baptized. And I guess that was a trend, in certain times, certain areas. And so this one fire baptized church split from another fire baptized church. They split away from one another. It said over the necktie issue. And when I read that, I thought, well, what was it? He didn't explain what the necktie issue was. I mean, is it that you're supposed to wear neckties or you're not supposed to wear neckties? And, and I kind of laughed about that until one time in a church I mentioned that, not this church, somewhere else, and a nice lady came and told me she wasn't laughing about it. She knew it was a serious matter, you see. And the necktie issue, and let me just explain it to you. Here's the way it breaks down. I'm trying not to laugh about this because it's so silly, So people in the world, like politicians and bankers, wear neckties. So, obviously, as Christians, if we don't want to be like the world, we should not wear neckties. Now, all you ladies, for once you're off the hook with this. Usually everybody's picking on women with their hair and their makeup and jewelry and stuff. I don't know if you've ever experienced that kind of stuff. But for in this case, it's the men. So the split was about you're worldly if you wear a necktie. So you see today how holy I am that I have no tie on today. That wasn't because I was trying to be extra holy. It's just because I just didn't want to bother with it. But if I ever, go to some formal event, I'll wear a necktie because it does not matter. Can we agree that that doesn't matter? But this church split over that. Now that's a good example of what Paul calls a doubtful disputation. And there are many, many others. Now Paul mentions two that were big in his day. And they were big in his day because the fight, the conflict, the controversy was between Jewish Christians who thought that Gentile Christians, well, maybe how can they be saved unless they do all the things we do? Unless they observe the food laws, unless they submit to circumcision. He didn't mention circumcision here. He talks about that in Galatians, and he's pretty hard on it. Or here it says, observing one day above another. So here in verse 2, let's just read it again. For one believeth he may eat all things. Another who is weak eats only herbs. Let not him who eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that eateth not judge him that eateth. Why? Now here's the bottom line. For God has received him. The same word which talks about how we receive Christ, it says God has received us. That's a beautiful thought if you think about it. God has accepted us. Same way we have accepted Christ. God accepts us. He receives us. Just like when somebody comes and knocks on your door and you open the door and you let them into your house, you have received them into your house. God has received us into His house. I said that you could understand this word received to mean embrace. God has embraced us. Just in the same way that it said the Pharisees got mad and said, Jesus, He embraces sinners. He receiveth sinners. Well, Paul here says, whether you have one opinion or another opinion on these doubtful disputations, on these trivial matters. In fact, let's just say this, the only thing that really matters, the only thing that is important is the fact that what John said makes us Christians. That we believe on His name, that we have received Him and believe on His name. That's the only thing that defines us. Everything else is a matter of your own conviction. In fact, if you read this chapter, if you read the whole thing, and I'm not going to do it right now, but he sums it up by saying, let every person be convinced in his own heart. Each one of us has a relationship with God, and each one of us has our own conscience, and so you have to follow your own conscience and make decisions based on what you believe in your own heart, what you have confidence about for yourself. But what he's pointing out here is you've got to recognize it just in the same way that you have your own conscience and make those decisions based on your own connection to and relationship with God. The person sitting next to you might have a slightly different view of things. So you can't be upset about that. We have to embrace one another despite our potential differences. Think about God embracing us. It's not like we're, just this close to being like God. We've got our flaws. He embraces us despite all of our differences, you might say. But He's happy to do that because He loves us. Now, another way to look at this, and to say it in slightly different words, is in John's Gospel, again, in chapter 14. And this is at the end now. Now, what we read in John 1 was at the beginning of the Gospel. This is at the end, just before Jesus is going to be parted. I'm going to read from John chapter 14 and verse 16. Jesus is about to go back to the Father, and He has His disciples there with Him at the Last Supper, and He's giving them some last-minute instructions in chapter 14, 15, and 16. And here I just want to draw your attention to one thing He said to them. With verse 16, John 14, 16. He said, I will pray the Father, and He shall give you another comforter. Now the word that's translated comforter there in the King James translation, in the Greek language, it's parakletos. The prefix para Well, April can tell you what a para is because she's got paras at the school. What do the paras do for you? They come to help, yes. The paras are people that are at the school there that help with the kids, right? And they do help in all kinds of ways. And that's what it means here. Comforter here is translated parakletos. That's the Greek word. It means one who is called alongside to help. Some translations call it an advocate. Lots of different ways it's translated. But parakletos means someone called alongside to help. So Jesus said, I'm going to the Father, but I'm going to pray and I'm going to ask the Father. And He's going to send you another helper, parakletos. He's talking about the Holy Spirit. That He may abide with you, that live with you, stay with you forever. Verse 17, even the Spirit of truth. The word truth there doesn't mean truthfulness like in court where you promise to tell the truth. It means reality of what's real. The Spirit of reality. That's a better way to understand that. Whom the world cannot receive. You know, we're talking about this word receive. He said the world cannot receive because it seeth Him not. Neither knoweth Him, but you know Him, for He dwelleth with you and shall be in you. See, He's talking to the disciples here, and He's saying, after I go away and go to the Father, I'm going to say to the Father, would you please send them another helper? And on the day of Pentecost, the helper showed up, Parakletos. And every Christian who believed on His name, from that point forward, the Parakletos was there to make real everything that Jesus promised. That's why John said, to them that believe on His name, we are the sons of God, who are born not of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. It's a work of God. So the Spirit of truth whom the world cannot receive, but you know Him. He dwelleth with you and shall be in you. Verse 18 says, I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. I like another translation that says, I will not leave you as orphans. I don't know if you've ever, sometimes when things are hard and we have problems and we have difficulties, we feel that way. We sometimes, that's part of the human condition. We are tempted to feel that way. But it's not true. The Spirit of reality is near to you and on board with us. Not just near to you, but in you. And He says, Jesus promises, I won't leave you helpless. I won't leave you an orphan. He says, I will send the Spirit of truth, and He will, see, the Holy Spirit comes into our lives, even though we don't see Him. See, He says this is why the world can't receive Him, because they don't see Him. But we believe, you see. We're believers. Mm-hmm. Even though we don't see Him either, we have the Word of Christ, and so we believe for that reason. He's here to help. He's the Paraclete. He's called alongside to help. But let's go on reading. I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. You notice He says, I will come to you, in the person of this Parakletos, this Holy Spirit. Yet a little while, verse 19, and the world seeth me no more, but you see me. Because I live, you shall live also. At that day, and by that He means at that day in which this all becomes a reality, in which the Holy Spirit comes into the world. Now listen to what He said, you'll know. At that day you shall know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you. Well, that little expression, I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I in you, there's only one way to understand that. That is connection or union. We have received Him. That's what defines us as Christians. But He embraces and receives us. Like Paul said, and we receive one another. And the reason we receive one another is because God has received us. So in that day you'll know I'm in the Father, the Father's in me, and you are in me, and I'm in you. In other words, we're all connected. Now, Jesus gave them some more instructions, and again, for time, it's all really good. It's sort of tempting just to take your time and read through it, but for today, I'm just going to skip over to chapter 17. He concludes this little discussion with the disciples, tells them all these beautiful things, all these very encouraging and positive things. And they were getting ready to go through a real trauma. He was going to be taken away from them and brutally beaten and finally crucified, and it was a real trial for them. Peter had a big failure at that time, as you know. Peter followed along to see what was going to happen, and he got scared. It's part of being human, you know. I mean, Peter's just a human being, you know, and he failed. He failed a major failure. One of the people hanging around outside where the trial was taking place saw Peter and said, "Hey, you're with him, aren't you?" "Oh, no." He said, "No." And then somebody else said, "Yes, your speech. I recognize you speak like a Galilean." So it said he denied him with an oath, with swearing. And he denied him 3 times, a pretty big failure. But you know what? Peter's failure did not exclude him. You know why? Because he had received Jesus, and Jesus had embraced him and received him, and they were one. So I want you to see, in chapter 17, it's a prayer. And Jesus prays for his disciples, from whom he was about to be parted. And it's a beautiful prayer, and there's lots of good things in it, but I just want to focus on one thing, beginning in verse 20. Look at what he says here. Up until verse 20, he's been praying for his disciples, those that were sitting there with him at the Last Supper. And in verse 20, he says, "Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also, which shall believe on me through their word." This should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up a little bit, because he's talking about you and me. He's praying for you and me that are sitting here right now, because we are those who have believed in him because of their word, because of their testimony about him. He says, "I pray not just for them, but for them which shall believe on me through their word." He's praying for us. You know, I always say when we're talking about this, especially the Apostle Paul, I'm sure he had no conception of the fact that 2,000 years in the future, people would be sitting around in a place he's never even heard of, far away, reading his words and benefiting from them. And these 12 disciples sitting there, well, 11, I think Judas is left by this time, but these 11 disciples whom he's praying for, I'm sure it never crossed their mind that way off in the future, 2,000 years in the future, there'll be people sitting in a place called Alva, Oklahoma, thousands of miles away, thousands of years separated, people they have no conception of, and we are benefiting from their words because they received him. Remember, he came into his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, they are the first ones that did that. So he's praying for us who believe on him through their word. Verse 21 says, that they all, listen to what he prays for us, that they all may be one. As thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. That's really an awesome thought if you think about it. He's saying, and he's praying for us that we see things the way he sees them. And the way he sees things is that he and the Father are one, but not just that. We, you and me, with our differences, with our human frailties, with our human flaws and faults, we're all one for one reason. Because we believe in him, we embraced him, he embraces us, and so now we're all one. And I think the point is he wants us to see, it's easy for us to get the fact that he loves us and we have our relationship with him, but we all, in the same way, are one with one another for the very reason that Paul stated, because God has received us. Okay, I think that's all we got today. Let's all stand up.